Karen yells at Muslim man for praying, then a famous actor shocks everyone. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The marketplace bustled with life that day, with vendors calling out to potential buyers and the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. Among the crowd was Amir, a soft-spoken man dressed in a crisp white shirt and slacks. He carried a quiet dignity about him, though he seemed slightly out of place among the loud exchanges and hurried shoppers. Amir had just finished a meeting at a nearby community center where he was working on a local outreach project. As the midday sun reached its peak, he realized it was time for his prayer. Spotting a quiet corner near the edge of the marketplace, he laid down his small, neatly folded prayer rug. He bowed his head, whispering softly in Arabic, completely focused on his connection with God. Nearby, shoppers passed by without a second glance, accustomed to the multicultural vibrancy of their community. That is, until Karen arrived. Karen was the kind of person who thrived on chaos, seeking control in the most trivial matters and always feeling the need to assert her dominance. Today, she wore her trademark oversized sunglasses and a designer purse slung over her shoulder. Her meticulously planned grocery run was disrupted when she noticed Amir praying. Her steps slowed, and her brow furrowed as she observed him from a distance. "What is he doing?" she muttered under her breath, her voice tinged with suspicion. Karen prided herself on her ability to spot trouble, though her conclusions often came more from prejudice than from logic. She stopped in her tracks, her groceries momentarily forgotten, and turned her full attention to Amir. Amir remained unaware of her gaze, his focus entirely on his prayer. The simplicity and humility of the act seemed to irk Karen even more. Her lips pursed into a tight line, and she adjusted her sunglasses as though preparing for battle. With a deep breath, she marched toward him, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Excuse me," Karen barked, standing over Amir with her arms crossed. He didn't respond, his quiet murmurs continuing uninterrupted. The fact that he didn't acknowledge her immediately sent a wave of indignation coursing through her. "Hello? I'm talking to you," she snapped, louder this time. Several shoppers turned their heads at the commotion, curious to see what was happening. A few even paused their shopping to observe, sensing that a scene was unfolding. Amir, still kneeling, finished his prayer with a calm "Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah" before looking up. His eyes met Karen's, and he saw the unmistakable mixture of anger and disdain in her expression. He stood slowly, dusting off his hands and offering a polite nod. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. Karen took a step back as though his civility caught her off guard. But she quickly recovered, jabbing a finger in the direction of his prayer rug. "What do you think you're doing here? This is a public space. You can't just do that." "Do what exactly?" Amir replied, his tone still even. Karen's eyes widened as though the question itself was offensive. "You know what I mean," she said, her voice rising. "This is America. We have rules. You can't just," she paused, gesturing vaguely, "do whatever that is out in the open. It makes people uncomfortable." Several bystanders exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval. One woman whispered to her friend, "What's her problem?" "He's not bothering anyone." Amir sighed softly, his patience already wearing thin. "Ma'am, I was simply offering my prayer. It's a peaceful act, and I assure you, it wasn't intended to inconvenience anyone." Karen scoffed, her arms flailing dramatically. "Peaceful? Oh please. How do we know you're not up to something? People like you're always—" "Karen," a voice interrupted, sharp and commanding. The crowd parted slightly as a middle-aged woman stepped forward, her expression a mix of irritation and disappointment. It was Anne, one of Karen's neighbors and a frequent advocate for tolerance within the community, and crossed her arms and fixed Karen with a withering glare. "You're embarrassing yourself. He's done nothing wrong." Karen's cheeks flushed, but her defiance remained. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," she retorted. "It's not normal. People shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable in their own neighborhoods." "Uncomfortable?" and repeated, her tone incredulous. "Uncomfortable is having your right to pray questioned in public. Uncomfortable is being treated like you don't belong. Maybe you should think about how he feels." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, many nodding in agreement. Karen glanced around, realizing she was losing support. Her bravado faltered, but she wasn't ready to back down just yet. Amir, sensing the escalating tension, raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Please," he said, addressing both Karen and the growing crowd. "There's no need for this to become an argument. I understand that not everyone is familiar with my practices, but I assure you, they come from a place of peace and respect." His words carried a quiet power that momentarily silenced the crowd. Even Karen seemed taken aback, though she quickly masked it with a derisive snort. "Peace and respect," she muttered. "Right?" Before anyone could respond, another voice cut through the crowd. This time it was deep, confident, and instantly recognizable. "Sounds to me like Amir here is showing a lot more respect than some people." All heads turned toward the source of the voice, and the crowd gasped as none other than Chris Evans, the Hollywood star, stepped forward. Dressed casually in jeans and a leather jacket, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who was used to commanding attention, but his piercing gaze was locked firmly on Karen. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as Chris Evans made his way to the center of the unfolding drama. His mere presence caused a ripple of excitement, but the focus of his attention wasn't the fans who were now pulling out their phones to record, it was Karen. She stood frozen, her bravado momentarily replaced by disbelief. "Chris Evans?" she stammered, her voice a mixture of confusion and awe. She adjusted her sunglasses, as though hoping to shield herself from the intensity of his gaze. "Yes, Chris Evans," he said dryly, stopping just a few feet from her. His tone carried a weight that silenced the crowd. "And I couldn't help but overhear your little conversation." Karen's face flushed, her eyes darting nervously between Chris and Amir. It's not a big deal. I was only trying to what?" Chris interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "Trying to make someone feel unwelcome? Trying to dictate how someone should live their life in a public space?" Karen bristled, her embarrassment quickly giving way to indignation. "I'm just saying that people have a right to feel safe in their community," she said, her voice rising again. "And seeing someone do whatever he was doing, it's unsettling for some of us." Chris's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer to Karen, his expression unyielding. "What's unsettling," he said, his voice low and steady, "is the way you've chosen to treat this man, who has done absolutely nothing to deserve your hostility. Do you even hear yourself?" Amir, who had been standing quietly, finally spoke up. "Mr. Evans," he began, his tone measured, "I appreciate your support, but there's no need to escalate things. I'm used to." "You shouldn't have to be used to it," Chris interrupted, turning to face Amir. His expression softened slightly, though his frustration was still evident. "No one should have to put up with this kind of ignorance." Karen crossed her arms, her lips pursed in defiance. "Oh please," she scoffed. "You don't even live here. You don't know what it's like." Chris raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint, incredulous smile. "You're right, I don't live here. But I've seen enough of the world to know that fear and ignorance are a choice. And right now you're making a choice to act out of both." The tension in the air was palpable, and the crowd hung on Chris's every word. Anne, who had been standing quietly near the edge of the scene, decided it was time to step in again. "Karen," she said firmly, stepping closer, "this isn't about you. It's about treating people with basic human decency. Amir has been nothing but respectful, and you're the one making this place uncomfortable." Karen glared at Anne, her frustration bubbling over. "Why is everyone ganging up on me? I'm just saying what I think. And that's the problem," and shot back. "What you think is rooted in prejudice and it's not okay." Chris nodded in agreement, folding his arms across his chest. "No one's ganging up on you, Karen. People are just tired of this kind of behavior. It's 2024, this shouldn't even be a conversation." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time she realized how alone she was in her stance. The crowd's disapproving stares, Anne's unwavering glare, and Chris Evans's pointed words all combined to strip her of the confidence she had wielded just moments ago. Meanwhile, Amir took a deep breath, his calm demeanor unwavering despite the intensity of the situation. He looked around at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had gathered. Some looked supportive, others curious, but all were watching him with a level of attention he wasn't accustomed to. "I think we've all said enough," Amir said gently, addressing both Karen and the crowd. "This isn't about me or her, it's about understanding and respect. We don't have to agree on everything, but we should at least try to treat each other with kindness." Chris turned to Amir, a faint smile softening his expression. "You're a better person than most," he said. "Including me?" Amir chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm just trying to do what I believe is right." Karen shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on the ground. For the first time, she seemed to be genuinely reflecting on her actions. The crowd, sensing the shift in her demeanor, began to disperse slowly, though many lingered to watch what would happen next. As the tension in the marketplace began to ease, a young boy approached Amir hesitantly. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Mister," he said shyly, tugging at Amir's sleeve, "what were you doing earlier?" Amir crouched down to the boy's level, his expression kind and patient. "I was praying," he explained. "It's something I do to connect with God and find peace." The boy tilted his head, his curiosity unabated. "Why do you do it here?" "Because it's important to me," Amir said with a gentle smile. "And sometimes when life gets busy, you have to find a moment for yourself wherever you can." The boy nodded slowly as though processing the information. "That's cool," he said finally before turning and running back to his mother, who gave Amir a warm smile of her own. Chris watched the exchange with a soft smile, clearly impressed by Amir's ability to handle the situation with such grace. He turned back to Karen, who was still standing silently, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Karen," he said, his tone less sharp but still firm, "maybe it's time you took a moment to reflect. Amir didn't owe you an explanation, but he still tried to help you understand. That says a lot about him. Now the question is, what does your behavior say about you?" Karen's lips parted as though she wanted to respond, but no words came out. She glanced at Amir, who met her gaze with neither anger nor judgment, just quiet patience. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had been wrong. Not just about Amir but about everything. The assumptions she had made, the way she had let fear and prejudice cloud her judgment. She began, her voice barely audible. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, surprising everyone, including Karen herself. She looked at Amir, her eyes watering slightly. "I didn't mean to. I shouldn't have." Amir raised a hand, gently interrupting her. "It's okay," he said softly. "What matters is that you're willing to learn. That's all anyone can ask." Karen nodded, swallowing hard. For the first time in years she felt something she couldn't quite put into words, something akin to humility. As the crowd continued to thin out, Chris clapped a hand on Amir's shoulder. "You handled that better than I ever could," he said, grinning. "I think the world could use more people like you." Amir chuckled, shaking his head modestly. "I think the world could use more people willing to stand up for what's right. So thank you for that." Chris smiled, giving Amir a firm handshake. "Anytime," and stepped forward, her expression warm. "Amir, if you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." "Thank you," Amir said sincerely. "And thank you for speaking up when it mattered." With that, the marketplace slowly returned to its usual bustle, the incident fading into the background as life went on. But for those who had witnessed it, the memory of what had transpired would linger, a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right and treating others with respect. As the marketplace settled back into its usual rhythm, Amir stood quietly, folding his prayer rug with careful precision. The tension in the air had dissipated, leaving behind a hum of whispers among the lingering onlookers. Karen had retreated to the edge of the crowd, visibly shaken. Her earlier bravado was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a hesitant vulnerability that she didn't quite know how to handle. Chris Evans, still standing beside Amir, exchanged a glance with Anne. "Well," Chris began, his voice carrying the same effortless charisma that had captured audiences worldwide, "I think it's safe to say this community just witnessed something important." And nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's moments like these that make a difference," she said. "But it takes more than just one moment to create lasting change." Chris's gaze shifted back to Karen, who was now staring at the ground, her hands fidgeting nervously. It was clear she was grappling with what had just happened, though whether it would lead to true self-reflection or stubborn denial remained to be seen. Amir, noticing the direction of Chris's gaze, spoke softly. "Sometimes people need time," he said. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But even the smallest step in the right direction is worth something." Chris nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're a patient man, Amir. I admire that." Meanwhile, Karen remained rooted in place, her mind racing. She replayed the events in her head, the harsh words she had spoken, the judgment she had passed without a second thought, and the way the entire crowd had turned against her. But what stood out most was Amir's response. He had every reason to lash out, to meet her anger with anger, but instead, he had chosen compassion. It was a choice she couldn't understand, and that baffled her more than anything else. Finally, mustering what little courage she had left, Karen approached Amir. Her steps were hesitant, her usual confidence replaced by an awkward uncertainty. The crowd, sensing another potential confrontation, paused their dispersal, their attention snapping back to the unfolding scene. Karen began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Amir looked up from his folded rug, his expression calm and unreadable. "Of course," he said simply. Karen glanced around nervously, aware of the watchful eyes on her. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I shouldn't have said those things. I was wrong." Amir studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Thank you for saying that," he said after a pause. "It's not easy to admit when we're wrong." Karen's cheeks flushed and she shifted uncomfortably. I didn't understand. And I guess I was afraid. But that doesn't excuse what I did." "No, it doesn't," Amir agreed gently. "But understanding begins with admitting we don't know everything. Fear often comes from ignorance, and the only way to overcome it is to learn." Karen nodded slowly, his words sinking in. "I'd like to learn," she said quietly. "If you're willing to teach me." Amir's lips curved into a small smile. "It would be my honor." The crowd murmured in approval, their earlier tension giving way to a sense of hope. Even Chris Evans looked pleasantly surprised, his trademark grin making a reappearance. "Well, this is a turn I didn't see coming," Chris said, his tone light but sincere. "Good for you, Karen." Karen glanced at him, her face a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. "Thanks," she said softly. "I guess I still have a lot to figure out. Don't we all?" Chris replied with a chuckle. "But you're off to a good start," and stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Karen's shoulder. "It's never too late to change," she said. "And the fact that you're willing to try says a lot." For the first time, Karen felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe she couldn't undo the mistakes she had made, but she could start making better choices moving forward. As the crowd began to disperse for good, a local reporter approached Chris with a notepad and a hopeful smile. "Mr. Evans," she began, "would you mind sharing a few words about what happened here today?" Chris glanced at Amir, silently seeking his input. Amir nodded, his expression encouraging. "Go ahead," he said. "Your voice reaches further than mine ever could." Chris hesitated for a moment, then turned to the reporter with his characteristic charm. "What happened here today is a reminder that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what's right," he said. "It's not always easy and it's not always comfortable, but it's necessary. And sometimes, it starts with something as simple as listening and learning." The reporter scribbled furiously in her notebook, her pen barely keeping up with Chris's words. "Do you think this kind of moment can lead to lasting change?" she asked. Chris smiled, his eyes twinkling with determination. "I think it has to," he said. "Because if we don't learn from moments like this, we're doomed to repeat them. And that's not a world I want to live in." The reporter nodded, clearly impressed. "Thank you, Mr. Evans. That's exactly what people need to hear right now." As the reporter walked away, Amir approached Chris, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for using your platform to amplify this message," he said. "It means a lot." Chris shook his head, his humility genuine. "You're the one who deserves the thanks," he said. "Your patience and grace in the face of all this, it's inspiring." Amir smiled, a quiet gratitude shining in his eyes. "We all have our roles to play," he said. "And today you played yours perfectly." Chris laughed, clapping Amir on the back. "Well, I'll take that as a compliment." As the marketplace returned to its usual bustle, Karen lingered for a moment, watching Amir and Chris from a distance. She still felt the sting of her earlier actions, but for the first time she felt a genuine desire to do better. And maybe, just maybe, she could. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the marketplace. It was a small moment, but it was a start, a step toward understanding, compassion, and a better future for everyone. The marketplace seemed to take on a different tone as the tension continued to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. Many of the bystanders who had watched the confrontation lingered, their faces thoughtful. Karen, though she had apologized, still stood at the edge of the scene, seemingly lost in her thoughts. Her tightly crossed arms and downcast gaze hinted at the internal battle she was fighting, a battle between her old ways of thinking and the possibility of change. Amir, meanwhile, had returned to his calm demeanor, speaking quietly with Anne and Chris. His composure seemed to have a grounding effect, not only on the two of them but also on the larger crowd. It was clear to anyone watching that Amir's strength came not from force or volume, but from the quiet, unwavering conviction in his beliefs. And turned to Chris, her expression curious. "So, what brings you to this little corner of the world?" she asked. "I mean, it's not every day you see a Hollywood star in our marketplace." Chris chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Would you believe me if I said I just wanted to grab some fresh produce? He joked. But then his tone shifted, becoming more sincere. Actually, I'm in town visiting some friends and working on a charity project. This community has a lot of heart and I wanted to see it for myself. And nodded, clearly impressed. Well, you picked quite the day to stop by. Chris smiled, his gaze drifting back to Karen. Yeah, I'd say so. Karen, still standing on the periphery, felt the weight of Chris's eyes on her. She glanced up, meeting his gaze for a brief moment before quickly looking away. She felt exposed, as though he could see straight through her bravado and into the insecurities she tried so hard to hide. But instead of looking away, Chris took a step toward her, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. Karen, he said gently, his voice carrying over the ambient noise of the marketplace. She hesitated, her instinct to retreat warring with her newfound desire to confront her own shortcomings. Finally, she turned to face him, her posture defensive but her expression unsure. What? She asked, her tone sharper than she intended. What do you want? Chris tilted his head, his expression kind but firm. I want to know what's really going on, he said. Because I don't think you're as angry or hateful as you seemed back there. Karen blinked, taken aback. What's that supposed to mean? It means I think there's more to you than what we just saw, Chris replied. And I think you know that too. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked away, her arms tightening around herself as though she were trying to shield herself from his scrutiny. I don't know what you're talking about, she muttered. Chris didn't push. Instead, he took a step back, giving her space. Okay, he said simply. But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. Karen looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why do you care? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. You don't even know me. You're right, Chris admitted. I don't know you. But I've seen enough people to know that no one's born with hate in their heart. Something puts it there. And sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen to help change that. Karen scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. You make it sound so easy. It's not, Chris said. But it's worth it. As Chris stepped away, Karen found herself watching him, her mind racing. His words had struck a chord, though she wasn't sure why. She had spent so much of her life building walls. Walls of judgment, walls of fear, walls of superiority. But now, for the first time, those walls seemed less like a fortress and more like a prison. Anne, who had been quietly observing the exchange, walked over to Karen, her expression thoughtful. He's right, you know, she said gently. It's never too late to change. Karen glanced at Anne, her defenses still partially intact. And what if I don't know how? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. And smiled, her warmth genuine. Then you start by taking one step. Just one. The rest will follow. Meanwhile, Amir had shifted his attention to a group of children who had been watching him with wide eyes. One of them, a boy no older than 8, tugged on his sleeve hesitantly. Excuse me, sir, the boy said, his voice shy but curious. What were you saying earlier? When you were praying? Amir knelt down to the boy's level, his smile gentle. I was reciting verses from the Quran, he explained. It's a way for me to connect with God and find peace. The boy tilted his head, clearly intrigued. Can you teach me? Amir chuckled softly. I can teach you some things if you'd like, he said. But the most important thing to remember is that prayer is about being kind and thankful. It's about finding peace in your heart. The boy nodded solemnly, as though Amir had just imparted the wisdom of the ages. Okay, he said. I'll try. The boy's mother, who had been watching from a few feet away, smiled warmly. Thank you, she said to Amir. I think the world could use more of that message. Amir nodded, his expression thoughtful. I think so too. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd began to thin further, leaving only a handful of people lingering in the marketplace. Karen remained among them, her earlier defensiveness slowly giving way to a quiet introspection. She watched as Amir interacted with the children, his patience and kindness evident in every word and gesture. It was a stark contrast to the image she had built in her mind, a contrast that forced her to confront the biases she hadn't even realized she carried. Finally, mustering her courage, Karen approached Amir once more. This time, there was no hesitation in her steps, no defensiveness in her posture. She stopped a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mr. Amir, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Can I ask you something? Amir turned to her, his expression open and patient. Of course, he said. What's on your mind? Karen hesitated, her eyes darting to the ground. Why were you so kind to me? She asked. After everything I said, everything I did, why didn't you just yell at me? Or walk away? Amir studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Because I believe that everyone deserves a chance to learn, he said simply. And because I've learned that anger doesn't solve anything. Kindness might not always change the world, but it can change someone's day. And sometimes that's enough. Karen blinked, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. I don't think I deserve that kindness, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe not, Amir said gently. But that's the thing about kindness, it's not about who deserves it. It's about who needs it. The weight of his words settled over Karen like a blanket, comforting yet challenging. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full extent of her regret, not just for what she had said to Amir, but for all the time she had let fear and prejudice guide her actions. I want to do better, she said finally, her voice filled with quiet determination. I don't know how, but I want to try. Amir smiled, his expression warm and encouraging. That's all anyone can ask, he said. And if you ever need help, I'm here. Karen nodded, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. For the first time, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself but for the possibility of a world where understanding and kindness could prevail. Karen lingered near the edge of the marketplace, watching as Amir gathered his belongings. She still felt the weight of her earlier actions, but something about Amir's words and demeanor had ignited a spark of hope within her. She had never been the type to reflect deeply on her behavior, but today felt different. It was as though the world had handed her a mirror, forcing her to confront parts of herself she had long ignored. Chris Evans, standing nearby, noticed her hesitation. He approached her with an easy smile, his presence both reassuring and grounding. You did something important today, he said, his tone encouraging. Karen glanced at him, her expression uncertain. I don't feel like I did, she admitted. I feel like all I did was mess up. Chris chuckled softly, shaking his head. We all mess up, he said. What matters is what we do next. And from what I can see, you're trying to make things right. That takes courage. Karen's lips twitched into a faint smile, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. It's hard to believe that one apology can make a difference. It's not just the apology, Chris said, his voice gentle but firm. It's the willingness to learn and grow. That's what makes the difference. As they spoke, Amir finished packing up his things and turned to Anne, who had been waiting patiently nearby. Thank you for standing up for me earlier, he said, his gratitude evident in his tone. It means more than I can say, and smiled warmly. You shouldn't have to face that kind of treatment alone, she said. And besides, I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Amir nodded, his respect for her clear. The world needs more people like you, he said, and laughed, though there was a note of sadness in her voice. And more people like you, she countered. Your patience and kindness, they're what the world needs most right now. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hesitant footsteps. Both Amir and Anne turned to see Karen approaching, her expression a mix of determination and nervousness. Excuse me, Karen said, her voice tentative. I wanted to say thank you for being so patient with me and for giving me a chance to learn. Amir smiled, his warmth undiminished. You don't need to thank me, he said. The fact that you're willing to reflect and grow is enough. Karen nodded, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. I still have a lot to learn, she admitted, but I want to try, and stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Karen's shoulder. That's all any of us can do, she said. And the fact that you're willing to try, that's a big step. Karen looked between Anne and Amir, her gratitude evident. Thank you, she said again, her voice firmer this time. I mean it. As Karen walked away, the three of them watched her go, each lost in their own thoughts, and turned to Amir, her expression curious. Do you think she'll really change? She asked. Amir considered the question for a moment before nodding. I think she's taken the first step, he said. And sometimes that's all it takes to start a journey. Chris, who had been listening quietly, chimed in. I think you're right, he said. And I think moments like this, moments where people are forced to confront their biases, they have the power to create real change. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of applause. The three of them turned to see a small group of onlookers clapping, their expressions filled with admiration. One of them, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stepped forward. Thank you, she said, addressing Amir, Anne, and Chris. Thank you for showing all of us what it means to stand up for what's right. Amir smiled modestly. It wasn't just me, he said. It was all of us. The woman nodded, her gaze lingering on Amir. Still, your kindness and patience, it's something we can all learn from. Chris grinned, his charm as effortless as ever. Well, I think we can all agree that Amir is the real hero here, he said, clapping Amir on the back. Amir chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just a man trying to do what's right," he said. "That's all any of us can do." As the applause died down, the marketplace began to return to its usual rhythm. Vendors called out to passers-by, children laughed and played, and the scent of fresh produce filled the air. But for those who had witnessed the events of the day, something had changed. There was a sense of unity, of understanding, that hadn't been there before. Karen, now standing at the edge of the marketplace, watched the scene unfold. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself but for the community as a whole. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wanted to be a part of making it better. Amir, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, turned to Anne and Chris. "I think we've all learned something today," he said. "And I think we can all take that lesson with us." And nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Absolutely," she said. "It's moments like these that remind us of what really matters." Chris smiled, his gaze sweeping over the marketplace. "And what matters is kindness, understanding, and standing up for what's right," he said. "I think we've all seen the power of that today." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the marketplace, Amir, Anne, and Chris stood together, united by a shared sense of purpose. They knew the journey toward understanding and compassion was far from over, but they also knew that every step mattered. And today they had taken a big one.